Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our final spring break screencast, we're going to focus on kind of more on the foreign policy aspects of the Cold War. So we're going to take a look at our second Cold War president, which is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And we're going to take a look at really kind of his take on the policy of containment. So remember when we introduced really the overarching American foreign policy during the Cold War is known as the Truman Doctrine, or the policy of containment, which is really in essence stopping the spread of communism around the world. Each successive American president really agrees with Truman as far as containment is concerned, but they have different ways of enforcing it and different ways about going about trying to implement containment. So what we're going to look at today is Eisenhower's foreign policy, how it affects us in the foreign policy realm, how it affects us domestically, and exactly what does it stand for. So this is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. Basically, every president from here on, they kind of just take the president's last name, Eisenhower, and put doctrine after it as far as their foreign policy is concerned. So you have the Eisenhower Doctrine, you have the Nixon Doctrine, you have, the Reagan Doctrine. All of them, they kind of just add that to the end of their name. So when you look at Eisenhower, looks are kind of very deceiving when it comes to Eisenhower. When you look at him, he kind of looks like your friendly grandfather figure. And that's what people said about him when they voted for him in 1952. He was kind of very appealing for those reasons. But that masked the reality of him being, a fierce general and and a very important military man. So don't forget, he's the head of all Allied command during World War II. So he really does have this very strong military background. So I think that's much more important to understanding his foreign policy is his military background, and because he really kind of uses that in his approach to the Soviet Union. So when you look at Eisenhower, the first thing I want you guys to notice, Eisenhower takes office basically right here, 1952. Okay, so this right here is showing you the buildup of nuclear weapons by the United States and the Soviet Union. And so this is the start of Eisenhower's administration right here in 1952. This is the end of the Eisenhower administration, basically like right here, right around here. So what you're looking at is Eisenhower presides over the largest expansion of the U.S. Nuclear weapons program in the history of the United States. It goes from I would say maybe like 1,000 nuclear warheads to about 27,000 under the Eisenhower administration. So it's a huge expansion, and that gives you a big clue into what really is the Eisenhower Doctrine and what is he trying to implement when it comes to the Soviet Union and the Cold War policy of his take on the policy of containment. Now, when you look at it, not only is he making more bombs during his administration, but the kind of bombs are improving. So we started with what are called A-bombs, which is the ones that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The next evolution of it is something called the hydrogen bomb, which is a little bit more powerful. And then finally, you have something called ICBMs. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. So by the end of the Eisenhower administration, we're starting to develop these ICBMs. This is actually what North Korea is trying very hard to develop right now. So if you're paying attention in the news, they keep doing missile tests. Actually, one just blew up yesterday. They failed one of their missile tests. But what they're trying to do is develop an intercontinental ballistic missile because they want to be able to target the United States and potentially kind of throw that into the diplomatic discussions that are happening between the U.S. and China and North Korea. So we're developing this back in the 1950s and 1960s. And this is kind of like what your standard ICBM might look like. This also helps us with the space program. The nuclear technology that we're developing helps us develop, more in the space program. So when you look at this really defines the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine is something called massive retaliation theory. Okay, so this is not the same as MAD. MAD, mutually assured destruction, is something a little bit different, but the Eisenhower Doctrine is something called massive retaliation theory, which in essence is we're going to deter the expansion of communism and the threat of the Soviet Union by basically threatening them with the amount of nuclear weapons that we have. So the idea is that if the Soviet Union were ever to try and implement a missile strike against the United States, we would retaliate with so many nuclear weapons that it wouldn't serve in their self-interest to ever attack the United States. And so that's really his approach, is kind of peace through strength. Basically, the threat of these thousands of nuclear weapons is going to be what he thinks is going to deter Soviet aggression, deter Soviet expansion, and deter the threat of the Soviet Union on United States soil. And so that's why you see this buildup of nuclear technology. It's because this is kind of their theory, the massive retaliation theory. And they let it be known, basically, to the Soviet Union that this is America's stance. And if you look at throughout the 1950s, we really don't see much of a threat from the Soviet Union. And so I think a lot of it subscribed to massive retaliation theory. There is no real direct conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There's, of course, battlegrounds of the Cold War, but it's not as extensive as maybe later or even earlier when Stalin was more forceful with in the late 1940s. Now, this other acronym, MAD, mutually assured destruction. This is also kind of playing into it, which is basically the theory that nobody's going to actually use a nuclear weapon because they realize if they use it, the opposition, whether it be the Soviet Union or the United States, is going to retaliate with a nuclear weapon in kind. And it would mean basically destruction for both parties and maybe destruction for the world, depending on how many nuclear weapons were actually used. Eisenhower's Secretary of State at the time, a guy named John Dulles. If you ever go down to D.C., the airport in D.C. is named after him. It's called Dulles Airport. But he believed in something called brinkmanship, which kind of goes along with this massive retaliation theory and MAD. And what this means is that you kind of push close to war, but not over the edge. So it's kind of like knowing how far to push the Soviet Union, because they believed, and many U.S. presidents believed, that you had to show strength to the Soviet Union. So you couldn't look weak. So you had to show the willingness to go to war, but know just when to kind of pull back so that you don't actually end up, in a war. So this always reminds me of, there's a game that they used to play actually in the 1950s, very dangerous game that they used to play. Teenagers used to do this. And the game was called Chicken. And essentially what you would do is you would go to like a long strip of highway, like a long stretch of highway, empty place. And you put one car at one end, another car at another end, and then two teenagers, they would drive full speed at one another. And basically the game was to see who would turn the wheel first. And if you turn the wheel first to avoid, crashing into the other person head on, you were considered like the chicken. So whoever could stay the course longer was kind of the winner. And I would think brinkmanship is kind of like an international diplomatic way of basically playing chicken with the Soviet Union. And so like Eisenhower is taking a very strong stance with the Soviet Union. He's not really, messing around very much at all. And so this you have to understand. So remember, you have to be able to compare Truman and Truman Doctrine to Eisenhower, and then throughout the Cold War, you have to be able to see the ebbs and the flows in the U.S. dealing with the Soviet Union. Now, domestically during the Cold War, it's an interesting time to be alive because you now have this threat. Eisenhower's building up nuclear technology. The Soviets have nuclear technology. Now there's this threat there could be a nuclear attack here in the United States. There's also the threat that we could destroy the entire world. We have that ability at our fingertips. So a lot of Americans are nervous about potentially nuclear fallout, an attack happening in their city, in their country. And so Americans are going to kind of respond in kind to try and develop plans to deal with this. So one of the first events that happens that really makes people nervous is the Russians start with their own space program. So we're also having a space race during the time. And so the Russians beat us on a couple of fronts. They're the first country to put a satellite into space. So the first satellite they put into space is they call it Sputnik. And basically it just kind of revolves around the Earth, rotates around the Earth, and they put it out there in outer space. Now, for Americans, this is a very nerve-wracking situation because when this happens, we don't know, number one, is it some kind of bomb or some kind of attack on the United States? Two, there's also this big fear of being spied on by the Soviet Union, like we talked about during our second Red Scare conversation. Remember, the second Red Scare is happening in conjunction with these Cold War policies of the 40s and the 50s, and so they're all kind of linked together. The Russians are also the first country to put an astronaut into space. They call their astronauts cosmonauts, but they're the first one to put an astronaut into space. And this is one of the reasons JFK comes out, later and says, like, we're going to put a man on the moon. It's a competition between us and the Soviet Union. Now, this fear of a nuclear attack kind of permeates American society in many different ways. So one of the drills they used to do at school, actually, they call them duck and cover drills, is they used to basically try to prepare for a potential nuclear attack on your city or the near countryside or the near area inside your city. So these are kids in elementary school doing duck and cover drills. So it's interesting. I always find this picture really funny because this kid obviously did not understand the drill very well of getting underneath the desk and protecting yourself using the desk. Now, your students always laugh and they say, like, well, what is this going to do? How is this going to protect you in a nuclear attack? You're right for the most part. If it's a direct attack, it's not going to help you. You're going to basically be eviscerated like that. But what this is supposed to protect you from is potentially, let's say it's an attack a little bit further away, and it blows out the windows and there's glass everywhere. So it's just a precaution. I also think it's much more psychological to make people and parents feel comfortable that we have a plan to protect your son or your daughter. Now, we can't be too critical of this because we do our own drills that if you really think about them, you might say, is this really going to help us? Is this really going to protect us? So we do that, intruder in the building drill. And you think about what we do. And, is that really going to help us in the event of an attack? Hopefully, but maybe not. And so, like, it's the same kind of thing. I think it's for peace of mind and make people think, like, hey, we have a plan. This is how we're going to deal with this situation. When in reality, it's catastrophic, and there's not much that you can do, especially in this case with nuclear bombs, that you can do to really save too many people if this actually were to happen. Now, Americans are also building their own backyard bomb shelters. So if you ever buy a house maybe from like the 1950s or 1960s era, you might be lucky enough to have a bomb shelter built into the backyard. So what they would do is they would build these, basically they're kind of like almost like a cellar that they would build in their backyard. You could hand make it. They also sold kits, so you could go to stores that popped up that were building bomb shelters, and you would pack it with food and all the essentials that you could potentially need in case of a nuclear fallout. Again, is this really going to be helpful? Maybe, maybe not, but it's really for peace of mind for people. And again, people are putting it in magazines, do-it-yourself kind of things. So when you look at it, the Cold War is a domestic event because it's affecting Americans' lives. It's affecting the way that they look at things and they do things. It's also an international event of the foreign policy and distinct approaches by each president. So hopefully you could draw parallels to our current time period. I drew one parallel with the school shooting epidemic that we have, but you could look at it through terrorism's lens. We're dealing with terrorism as a foreign threat, but also a domestic threat. There's lots of parallels to be made. All right, guys, hopefully you enjoy the rest of your vacation. If you're celebrating Easter, hopefully you have a great Easter. I'll see you guys on Wednesday when we come back to school.